Hello and welcome to the History of Japan podcast, episode 611, The Final Frontier, Part 7. From its inception, Manchukuo/Manchukuo was a mess of contradictions. I think it's fair to say that as a result, its prospects in the long term were dim from the jump. We've covered, of course, the messy racial contradictions that underlay Manchurian propaganda, the claims about the unity of the five races, really being undercut by the reality that those with Japanese passports enjoyed distinct legal privileges in Manchuria nobody else had. Similarly, the claim that Manchuria would be a fairer and less exploitative state was hard to take seriously given that Japanese control over the region was based on subordinating local elites through sweetheart deals. Nobody was going to get a new, less exploitative landlord or boss because that landlord or boss had almost certainly cut a deal with the Japanese to stay in power as long as they played ball with the Guangdong army. A secret agreement that didn't go public until after the end of the Second World War really makes it clear how much this whole system was intended to be just a fiction to legitimize Japanese colonial rule. That agreement took the form of a letter written to the commander of the Guangdong army, General Honjo Shigeru, by Emperor Puyi himself, though at that point he was just the chief executive. It was attached to the first treaty between Japan and Manchukuo in September 1932. The treaty formally recognized Manchukuo as an independent state on the Japanese side, while the Manchukuo government agreed to the stationing of Japanese troops for mutual defense. That was the public side of the agreement, and on its face, it wasn't equal, but it wasn't inherently exploitative, or at least not unusually so. But the secret letter between Honjo and Puyi added 4 more items summarized by Professor Yamamuro Shinichi in his History of Manchuria. 1. Manchukuo will rely on Japan for national defense and the maintenance of order, and Manchukuo will shoulder the costs. 2. Manchukuo will rely on Japan and agencies designated by Japan for supervision over railways, harbors, waterways, and air routes, as well as the construction and opening of new roads, all of which the Japanese military deems necessary to national defense. 3. Manchukuo will energetically assist with various installations the Japanese military deems necessary, that's bases they're talking about. Finally, 4. The recommendation and consent of the commanding officer of the Guangdong army shall be essential in appointing Japanese of great insight and renown to the positions in the Manchukuo cabinet and appointment and dismissal of Japanese to other central and local government offices. For those of you playing along at home, all of this more or less is the dictionary definition of a puppet state, and in fact, this letter was actually written on March 6th, months before the treaty was even signed, and was dated March 10th, 4 days later, after it was actually written. If you're wondering why that could possibly matter, well, Puyi didn't become chief executive of Manchukuo until early March, and so probably this suggests that one of the preconditions for him being given the job at all was being handed this letter and being told to sign it. In other words, this was always the plan, and he knew it going in. I find all this kind of fascinating, particularly as part of a larger pattern where the leadership of the Guangdong army both tried very hard to maintain the fiction of Manchukuo as an independent state, and at the same time, really didn't. So for example, a copy of this letter was handed to the office of the Prime Minister in Tokyo in April 1932, just a month before said Prime Minister Inukai Tsuyoshi was assassinated for insufficient enthusiasm over the Manchurian cause. The Tokyo government initially objected, noting, of course, that nothing in the Guangdong army's remit gave it permission to negotiate treaties at all, as that was not a part of the traditional powers of any military on the planet. But still, the Guangdong army commander, Honjo Shigeru, got the government to cave in and approve the terms on a temporary basis. And of course, that temporary basis remained until the end of the Second World War and the collapse of Manchuria itself. Again, obviously a rubber stamp, but it gave the veneer of legitimacy. If you're wondering, by the way, about what happened to the previous Japanese holdings in Manchuria, the Guangdong leased territory was never given over to the Manchukuo government. The army appears to have planned to renegotiate an extended lease at some point in the future, but remained in direct control over the territory until 1945. Montetsu as a company also continued to operate and retained its special privileges of control over the land its tracks ran on, but its independent corporate leadership was largely replaced over the early years of Manchukuo, and in short order, Mantetsu was taken over largely by pro-army people and became an appendage of the Guangdong Army's control of the region. Similarly, proclamations by the new government, penned of course at the behest of Honjo and other Japanese commanders, waxed poetic about the liberation of Asia and how Manchuria would be a new, more representative government for its people. Unlike Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist regime in China, where only the Kuomintang could operate openly, it would not be a single-party dictatorship, it would reflect the will of the people. Except, of course, that every government posting had to be approved by the Guangdong Army leadership, and those selected for postings in the Manchukuo government were told as a part of their positions to hire primarily, or sometimes only, Japanese nationals in their support staff. Which meant the government in practice was led by Japanese puppets from the region, advised almost entirely by Japanese officers. Yamamuro Shinichi actually put together a chart of the ethnic breakdowns of the early Manchukuo national government as of 1935. He broke down job holders along the categories of Chinese, which includes Manchu and Han, Mongol, Japanese, and Russian, and showed that while Chinese nationals did hold the most positions, 2,474 out of 4,939 surveyed, Japanese nationals were right behind them at 2,386. In other words, 48.3% of government jobs were held by Japanese nationals who, remember, were not required to naturalize or become Manchurian citizens to get those jobs. The most important positions were completely dominated by Japanese. Less important or obviously rubber stamp institutions like the Imperial Household Department or the Legislative Yuan were pretty light on Japanese nationals, respectively 11.2% and 18.2% of their personnel, but positions like the court system or the public prosecutor's office were 90% or more Japanese staff. The military administration of Manchuria itself was 40% Japanese. If you're wondering, the numbers for local government were pretty similar to the ones for national government. 7,100 positions surveyed, 3,517 held by Han Chinese or Manchu, 3,249 held by Japanese, so 45.8% of the local government administrative positions. Similarly, the Constitution, proclaimed in early 1933 for this new state, was on its face very devoted to the appearance of representative government. The chief executive, who, if the people expressed approval, could potentially become emperor, possessed powers very similar to those of Japan's own emperor, including his own privy council, with a state council similar to the cabinet underneath him to manage the administration of government. A legislative council and a judicial yuan, essentially a court system and parliament, modeled on those of the Republic of China, rounded out the traditional three-part structure of divided government that was the hallmark, so the men of the Meiji era had been told, of all civilized countries. And there were, technically, multiple political parties, but A, of course, they were tightly circumscribed, only a limited number were actually allowed to operate, and B, there was a preferred party, the Xiehehui, or Kyowakai in Japanese, usually translated as the Concordia Association. Its politics were loosely defined, honestly. Basically, all the propaganda we've talked about, loosely watered-down rhetoric about Confucian government and racial harmony and Pan-Asian unity, and eventually, as Manchuria's resources were exploited for the war in China, on thrift and economy and saving to support Japan's just war effort. Like the Republic of China, the Manchukuo Constitution made use of some extra independent branches of government, in this case a fully independent police yuan that served as a fourth branch of government, and a supervisory council as the fifth, responsible for overseeing the other branches and combating corruption, similar to the control yuan of the Republic of China. Overall, the Constitution was a sort of hybrid between those of Imperial Japan and the Republic of China, though of course Manchuria's constitution didn't include even a limited list of rights accorded to subjects. There were no mentions of limits on the power of the government over its citizens whatsoever. As I researched all of this, what I started to wonder, and what some of you might be wondering too, is why bother? Nobody bought the fiction Manchuria was an independent state, so why go through the time and effort of signing treaties, having a constitution, even bothering with a puppet government? Who was the song and dance for? Initially, of course, it was for the international community to try and prove Manchuria was a legitimate state, but obviously that didn't work. That was clear by the end of 1932. But the more I read about this period, the more I start to think the real target of all this propaganda was not the wider international community, but specifically the people of China. Remember, the radicals in the Guangdong army who'd pushed for an invasion had done so in large part because they believed the surge of Chinese nationalism was dangerous to Japan's position in Asia. Left unabated, it would result in Manchuria reunifying with a nationalist China and pushing Japan out of Asia, pushing it off of its lifeline on the continent. So maybe the goal was to try and counter-program Chinese nationalism, to convince the people of China to buy into a different vision of what that nationalism meant that was more compatible with Japan's goals on the Asian mainland. This was why, for example, a separate policy proposal to just have a Japanese advisory board over the Manchurian government was rejected by the Guangdong Army and their collaborators in pro-Japanese groups like the Manchurian Youth League. It would be too obvious. It would give lie to the story they were trying to craft. But even so, the story was not that successful at compelling people. From what we can tell, government propaganda from the Manchukuo authorities never really had much success in actually changing people's mind. This was pretty obvious even to those living through the moment itself. Yanai Haratadao, a professor of colonial policy at Tokyo Imperial University, noted at the time that Manchukuo operated no differently than a regular colony. It was clearly an instance of naked exploitation, no matter what the rhetoric about the kingly way of government and racial harmony. In other words, those actually responsible for cooking up Japan's policies didn't buy what the Guangdong army was selling. And frankly, that never really changed. For example, in March 1934, Puyi did make the jump from chief executive to emperor, supposedly because the will of the people acclaimed it so, in fact because the new commander-in-chief of the Guangdong army, Koiso Kuniaki, had decided that it was time to do this and convinced the cabinet to approve his plan. Koiso believed that it was necessary to install a monarch in Manchuria that was both pliant to Japan and avoided the pitfalls, as he saw them, of even the appearance of republican or representative government. A lot of army leaders like him, as a general rule, were deeply hostile to any form of democracy as a concept because they believed it spiritually corrupted and weakened people. When Puyi was finally crowned as emperor in March 12, 1934, this is how one of his own advisors, Ishimaru Shizuma, described the scene. Quote, "Everything was carried out with brevity and extreme quiet. The celebrants along the route dotted the way, forming a barrier. Many were local Japanese residents, while comparatively few were Manchurians. One could see nothing but the police all the way from Datong Palace to the site of the ceremony. I saw not a single onlooker, which tended to evoke a sense of desolation." You might think he was being melodramatic, but here's how the American journalist Edgar Snow, who would later become famous for interviewing Chairman Mao for the book that became Red Star Over China, described the scene. Quote, 50,000 troops flank the route, 2 lines of soldiers facing each other across a pathway nearly half a mile wide, completely cleared of life. Japanese troops with fixed bayonets stand guard behind Manchukuo troops sans bayonets. And these are the emperor's audience, no others, no roars of popular approval, no shouts of happy populace greet the imperial parade, but only the phalanx of uniforms. Nothing stirs. Snow was, all things considered, pretty astute in his observations of Manchuria. He wrote in the very same report that by making Puyi a puppet emperor, quote, "to whose divine wisdom all Japanese maneuvers could be attributed, Manchukuo affairs could be conducted with simplified dispatch. Whether it was to be Puyi's signature on a formal annexation agreement or Manchukuo's declaration of war on China, Russia, or some other power in support of her ally, Japan, the move could be accomplished with a minimum of trouble of expense." Which was absolutely true, even if no official Japanese documentation ever explicitly stated that goal. And given all that, who was going to take this seriously, the fiction that Puyi was an emperor and not a puppet on a string? Particularly since just a few hours later, Puyi changed into a military uniform and went over to the other side of his palace complex, which was located in the city of Changchun, renamed by imperial edict to Xinjing, the new capital, as a direct reference to the old imperial capitals of Beijing and Nanjing. Puyi specifically made his way from the front of his palace, the Datong or Great Harmony Palace, to the Qinmin Mansion, meaning diligence on behalf of the people, in its interior. That building housed his throne, and there he read a rescript on his ascension to the throne, which read in part, quote, "We anticipate becoming a permanent fixture by always cooperating, working together with the Japanese Empire in all long-term plans for protecting the country and salutary tactics for governing the state." What a totally normal thing to say in your proclamation, that no matter what happens, Japan will always be your ally. In all of this, if you're wondering, the only thing Puyi tried to push back on was his desire to be crowned in the traditional robes of imperial office. The Japanese wanted him in a military uniform. They compromised, the coronation parade was done in the traditional robes, the rescript was read in the military uniform. On the Japanese side, the pressure to try and get more and more control over this new puppet state was driven in large part by an increasing certainty among Japanese leaders of an impending crisis in international politics. In that crisis, Manchuria would be key as a strategic base on the Asian mainland and a source, of course, of supplies. It's important to remember that while nobody knew what World War II would look like exactly, everyone could tell by the mid-30s that things were unstable. Germany was now several years into Nazi rule and the rearmament associated with it. Europe's powers had shown themselves unwilling to stand up to him immediately, but were starting to build their own war fleets in response, which, thanks to the naval arms limitation treaties Japan's liberal politicians had signed before 1931, meant that by 1936 Japan would be outgunned in the Pacific by the United Kingdom and United States. In China, a brief round of fighting with Japan had already broken out shortly after the invasion of Manchuria. It had ended after a bloody stalemate in Shanghai, but only confirmed the assessment of army leaders that all-out war with China was inevitable. And of course, there was the ever-growing danger of the Soviet Union rapidly industrializing under Joseph Stalin. General Tsukushi Kumashichi captured the prevailing mood in one memorandum back home when he predicted, quote, a crisis of 1936. Quote, Japan, for which a national crisis is 100% predicted around 1936, must before then advance to an indisputable position, the imperial task of creating Japanese Manchukuo. In 1936, when the high tide of the emergency facing the empire shall arise, it shall be necessary to set the situation in Manchuria in a unified and stable sphere with respect to all changing circumstances. Thus, although the measures to be taken are of course many and varied, the establishment of the monarchical system in Manchukuo is the most appropriate. If the creation of a monarchy comes one day earlier, then it will benefit by one day the stability of the scene in Manchukuo. It will be best to seek out an opportunity to do this while the present period is maturing. Depending on how you parse things, of course, the crisis of 1936 didn't quite work out the way Tsukushi and others had planned. The biggest crisis of that year was not an overseas conflict, but a coup by elements of the army that was ultimately quashed. But it only took one additional year for the army leadership to stumble its way into an unwinnable war in China, so they more or less kept to the timetable. And as they did, the leadership of the Guangdong army worked harder and harder to bind Manchuria to Japan, even as they maintained the facade of independence. For example, by 1935, Manchukuo had its first national holidays. These included the anniversary of Puyi's coronation, but his first trip to Japan was also celebrated as a national holiday. During his second trip to Japan, he proclaimed a rescript on the consolidation of the basis of the nation, announcing as a part of this that his government would start building kokuhonsha, national foundation shrines to the Shinto sun goddess, an ancestor of the Japanese imperial line, Amaterasu. Puyi's rescript read in part, quote, We have recently built the National Foundation Shrine to enshrine the sun goddess Amaterasu. We shall offer our deepest veneration and in our own person pray for the prosperity of the people, and we shall set an example for all posterity. We thus hope the basis of the nation may be consolidated by reverencing the way of the gods, and the principle of the nation be established in the teachings of loyalty and filial piety. Manchukuo will continue with divine blessing from the sun goddess and the protection of His Majesty, the Emperor of Japan. Again, a totally normal thing to do to say that your country will be sustained by gods and emperors from a place not your own. Now, from this point onward, the story of Manchukuo as a nation starts to take on something of a repetitive cast. I think you get some idea by this point of how the government works. But there are two more things I'd be remiss not to touch on as a part of a history of this region. The first is a bit more on the issue of collaboration. We talked a little bit about this previously, about how the Japanese won over elites in Manchuria with promises their lives would remain relatively undisturbed. But it wasn't just elites who collaborated. The Manchurian bureaucracy, police, and military were filled with people who decided to play ball with the new regime. So why? For some, the message of the regime did prove convincing. Jennifer Imber records the story of one Miss Gu in her essay on collaborators in Manchuria. Miss Gu, who was Han Chinese, joined the state-run Wangdao Daodahui, a state-run organization intended to promote Manchuria's Confucianized propagandic principles in 1933. Her membership was not voluntary. Her dad had been involved in the Kuomintang, the nationalist party of Chiang Kai-shek and his government in Nanjing, and had been imprisoned for it. She was told her participation in an approved political organization was the best way to get him out. As Imber records, quote, initially she did not like the society, but once they taught Confucianism, it changed the members of the society's, hearts. Soon she became a devoted lecturer, disseminating information on female virtue, on breastfeeding, women's education, and prenatal education. After her period of collaboration with Manchukuo in teaching these values, she continued in Taiwan in 1945. It might seem odd that that's how she was won over, but it's not out of line with what you see in other places in the 30s, where, for example, some German feminists did collaborate with the National Socialist Women's League, and quite a few Japanese feminists ended up working with the army to get laws in place protecting, for example, the rights of mothers. Basically, working with a repressive government could still give some who didn't previously have much of a chance for a public social role the ability to have one, and it was worth a lot to those people and could make them willing to overlook the nature of the regime they were working for. It's also worth noting that while Manchukuo was a repressive dictatorship, it allowed for some degrees of free expression that didn't exist in the Republic of China at the time. Chiang Kai-shek's Republic of China was a ferocious one-party dictatorship with a brutal secret policing system. Manchukuo did have laws limiting free expression by comparison, but those laws were unevenly enforced. And that meant that in some cases it was actually easier to speak your mind in Manchukuo as, say, a writer, than it was in Nanjing. Now, officially, the state had no legal rights around free speech, and indeed, right after it proclaimed its independence, the new government destroyed about 60,000 books it considered subversive, closed booksellers, and announced plans to monitor publishers to ensure control over what was being published. But that monitoring focused mostly around publication laws that required publishers to register with the government and really only screened them around one criteria. Did their work support Manchurian nationalism, or were they supporters of the Kuomintang? In other words, if you weren't publishing stuff about how great Chiang Kai-shek or the Republic of China was, you were generally left alone. Which was a pretty big departure, actually, from the Republic of China, where by 1934, Chiang Kai-shek was in the middle of promoting a New Life movement that tried to promote what he saw as traditional Chinese values, while directly attacking ideas like communism, socialism, and feminism that were quote-unquote subversive. This isn't to say that Manchuria was some paradise of free expression, only that different things got you into trouble there. The Chinese author Mein Yang, for example, was not only able to write and publish a novel, Xie or Crabs, that was explicitly critical of patriarchy and materialism, and capitalism in general. She won a prestigious literary award for it in Japan and got to fly to Tokyo to receive it. That's not normally what you think of as collaboration, of course, and Manchuria was light on the sort of collaborators identified by the journalist Werner Rings in his study of collaboration in Europe. Rings identified 4 basic degrees of collaboration, from unconditional collaborators, people bought into the new regime, like, say, French fascists in Vichy France, to neutral collaborators who did so for self-interest, conditional collaborators who collaborated in some but not all areas, to tactical collaborators who were trying to work for the resistance and secretly undermine the government. There were not a lot of either the first or fourth degrees of collaborators in Manchuria, the fully ideologically aligned or the conditional resistors working behind the scenes to subvert the government. But there was no shortage of limited collaborators like Manyang, and frankly, most people found their self-interest lay in simply not engaging with the government at all. Today, the phrase used in mainland China for any degree of collaboration is hanjian, traitor to the Chinese people, or, a more inflammatory translation, race traitor. Those branded as collaborators with the Japanese are remembered as the worst sort of criminal, but interestingly, the worst opprobrium in the public consciousness is usually just reserved for a small few, people like Wang Jingwei, who led the collaborationist government set up in the rest of China after the outbreak of a wider war between Japan and China. The more low-level collaboration that most engaged in, particularly in Manchuria, tends to just not be talked about that much in official Chinese narratives today. For example, the old imperial palace in Changchun is now a museum to the history of Japan's rule over Manchuria, but it only directly mentions two collaborators. The first, of course, is Puyi. The second is Ma Jianshan, the military man we talked about last week, who did briefly defect to the Japanese, but remember, also undefected and joined the resistance. Beyond this, collaboration just doesn't get that much mention in the official historical memory of Manchuria. To the extent it does, it's often used as a sort of warning to future generations about the danger of anti-nationalist thought in China. Take, for example, the narrative My Life as a Puppet, written by one Huang Fujun and published in 1993. This was probably written while he was in prison as a part of his confession to the communist authorities, and has to be taken with a grain of salt as a result, but it also makes a good source for an official understanding of collaboration as it's remembered in China today. Huangfu was the head of the Ministry of Civil Affairs in Manchurian. His story focused mostly on how badly the Japanese military treated him as they worked alongside him. He talked about constant monitoring by the military police, about coworkers who only spoke Japanese, which he didn't know, and basically froze him out of discussions. Quote, "Working in this type of environment made me uncomfortable, but I had no other way." He constantly talks about himself as a tool of the Japanese, in other words, not taking responsibility for doing anything, just being used by them, and spent a lot of the narrative lamenting that he didn't do more to secure better tools and food for the farmers of Manchuria. By the way, he's officially listed as lost after the war, which probably means that at some point after writing all this, he died in his imprisonment. His story helps us see how Chairman Mao and how today's communist leadership in Beijing wants collaboration to be remembered, the act of individual, weak-willed cowards. Huangfu is more pitiable than hateable, the sort of subordinate villain to the main antagonist of the story, the Japanese military leadership. But the reality, of course, is that most collaborators weren't villains, even though it's tempting to think of them that way. They were people trying to survive in a bad circumstance as best they could. It's also worth noting that the worst crimes of the Japanese regime in Manchuria required no outside help from collaborators at all. I have been debating as a part of this series how much time I want to spend on the actions of Unit 731, the biological warfare unit set up in Manchuria. I do have a whole episode about them in the backlog. It's episode 238, if you're curious. Even so, I didn't feel right not mentioning anything about them at all as a part of this story, both because of the horrors that Unit 731 represents, and because for the first few decades after World War II in particular, the nature of Unit 731 was not discussed that much in English language discussions on Asian history. It's not as well known as I think it really should be. I'm not going to try and be comprehensive here. Again, this is more of an overview of Japanese imperialism in Manchuria. If you want an episode just on Unit 731, again, the place to go, episode 238. So if you're not familiar with it, Unit 731 was a division of the Guangdong Army set up just outside the city of Harbin to manage an illegal biological and chemical weapons program. Japan's liberal governments in the 20s had signed on to, among other things, the Geneva Convention of 1925. That's the one that bans biological warfare. But of course, for militarists in the Guangdong Army, those treaties were not worth the paper they were written on. Initially, Unit 731 was an outgrowth of the medical facilities set up by the Guangdong Army in its leased territories, a part of that medical network set up after the Russo-Japanese War to do things like vaccinate the local population against disease. After all, that would prevent disease from spreading to Japanese soldiers too. That's how herd immunity works. Not exactly charitable. But by sometime around 1937, the nature of the program had started to shift. Specifics around who decided what when are hard to come by because so many related files were either destroyed to avoid war crimes prosecution, lost in the war, or taken out of Japan for reasons we'll get into. All we know for sure is that at some point the focus of the program started to shift from research around disease prevention to research around the weaponization of disease. Almost certainly that had something to do with the unit falling under the command of one Ishii Shiro, an army medical surgeon who'd been commissioned in 1921 and who had been advocating for a Japanese bioweapons program since the Geneva Convention in 1925 banned them. His logic, from what I can tell, was basically they wouldn't be banned if they didn't work. Ishii was able to convince the Guangdong Army Command to give him substantial leeway and access to Chinese and Russian prisoners for experiments. Under Ishii's command, Unit 731 engaged in horrible actions like deliberately exposing victims to plague, anthrax, and other biological agents, as well as deliberately poisoning water supplies in Chinese villages to track the spread of disease, deliberately subjecting Chinese prisoners to hypothermia to test treatments, and similar types of things. You'll note I try to avoid the word experiment here for a couple of reasons. First, basically every sort of medical ethics in existence would ban these sorts of practices as legitimate experimentation. It's also my understanding that the scientists engaged in these actions didn't even keep very good records. There's no control group for most of these experiments, for example, so the data is useless. Speaking purely personally, this is the sort of thing that often irks me about modern discussions of both Unit 731 and the experiments performed by men like Joseph Mengele at Auschwitz. There's a sort of discourse of they learned something but at what cost. That's a distortion of reality. It implies something useful comes out of experiments like this. It didn't happen that way. The experiments were fundamentally flawed and didn't really provide much useful data. Now, it's unclear to what extent information about Unit 731 and the related Unit 100, which operated just outside Changchun, was made available in Tokyo. We've seen the Guangdong Army leadership generally didn't have a habit of working with anyone outside of its direct chain of command. There's no information as far as I'm aware that Emperor Hirohito was ever briefed directly on its actions, but his youngest brother, Prince Mikasa, definitely was, and it made him a fierce critic of the army and its actions in China later in life. The death toll associated with Unit 731 is also unclear. Most of the English language scholarship around the program gives a figure of around 200,000 people, but of course it's hard to track given the nature of epidemic disease. After the war, the US government apparently thought there was something to the program because Ishii Shiro was protected from prosecution in exchange for his notes. The US government would maintain its own illegal bioweapons program despite being a signatory to the Geneva Convention all the way until 1969, when Richard Nixon discontinued it. Again, this is just a sampling of the horrors of Unit 731, and I mention it here to help illustrate a point. Ultimately, despite some structural differences in how Manchuria was managed, Army leadership didn't treat it that differently from, say, Korea. It was a place to exploit for resources, and that included the people living there. Next week, in the last episode of this series, we'll see how that attitude led to the rapid disintegration of Manchuria as a regime as the situation in Asia shifted. For now, that's all for this week. Thank you very much for listening. This show is a part of the Facing Backward podcast network. You can find out more about this show at facingbackward.com. You can also support the network on Patreon. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next week for the final episode in the series.